8. Daniel chapter 8. In Daniel chapter 7, we had a vision that Daniel relays to us. Daniel tells us of this vision that he had. And it's a very kind of general and universal in its location and what's going on. And so here in Daniel chapter 8, we have a much more specific location, a much more specific interpretation. In Daniel chapter 7, we had this vision, and the angel was asked, hey, tell me about this, and he wouldn't give a whole lot of particulars. He kept on kind of just, hey, you're missing the point. Don't look at the beast. Look at the Ancient of Days. Don't look at the beast so much. Look at the Ancient of Days. And now in Daniel chapter 8, we have kind of the exact opposite happening. Gabriel is going to come and give a very specific, very straightforward interpretation of what Daniel is seeing. It's going to disturb Daniel. It's going to disturb Daniel because what he's most concerned about is the people of God and how this is going to affect the people of God. I know, I want to hear me preach too. I know, I want to hear me preach too. Awesome. All right, and so here in Daniel chapter 8, we have this setting, and I want to make sure you know this setting of what's going on here. King Belshazzar is the king, right? And this is in the 3rd year of his reign. You remember Belshazzar from earlier in the book. Belshazzar was the guy who had the big party and took all of the holy things of God and had a big party with the holy things of God. This is a guy whose life was taken from him, right? Because here comes who? Does anybody remember? There was Darius the Mede, right? He comes in and he takes over. You guys remember this part of the story, right? And he comes and he takes over the city, and then he's killed. Belshazzar is killed. And so this happens long before. It actually happens before Belshazzar's party. So what I want to give you is there's a vision that Daniel is given here that is going to help him in that moment. You remember the story? They're having a party, 1,000 people, a hand with no body shows up, right? It starts writing on the wall. And there needs to be an interpretation of what's written on the wall. And so Belshazzar's wife is the one who says, hey, there's this old guy named Daniel, and, your grandfather used to use him, right, and talk to him. He seems to know everything. So they bring Daniel in, and Daniel speaks with confidence and boldness in that moment. Why did he speak with confidence and boldness? How could he speak with boldness and confidence in that moment? I think Daniel 8 gives us some of the picture of why he could speak with such boldness and confidence. As he gets this vision in Daniel 8, this is going to propel him to be able to speak into this situation that he walks into. Okay, so I want to make sure you understand how this all fits together. This happens before the story. Okay, so that when he walks into the party and he sees the handwriting on the wall, he can speak with confidence that God is going to judge Belshazzar, that God is going to set all things right, that God is not going to stand for his madness any longer. And so here in Daniel chapter 8, we have a picture of what Daniel sees. So I just want you to follow along. Daniel chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. It was in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel. If you go back to chapter 7, he's very general about where he was and what he saw and that sort of thing. It seems like more he was in heaven. Now he's in a very specific place, okay, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the hosts. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Well, that's probably a good move, right? Because otherwise it's just a weird dream. Anybody have weird dreams last night? Anybody have weird dreams? Every time, because I've been studying this, and it seems like every time I go to sleep, as I'm studying through Daniel, I just have weird dreams at night. Okay? And mine don't have rams and that sort of thing, but I'm just like, I wake up and go, what in the world? I'm not scared, I'm not troubled, I just wake up and say, what in the world? So if I'm not trying to understand this vision, right, if Daniel's not trying to understand this vision, it's just an odd occurrence. It's just a dream, right? At this point, he's trying to understand it, and he says, Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. I want you to understand, I want you to hear me on this, okay? This is a very important point, and we overlook this far too often. I want you to see what happens. Daniel had seen the vision, and he wants to understand the vision. Can he understand without help? In that moment, he needs God's messenger to tell him what God means. I want you to understand that. That doesn't mean you need me. That means you need His Spirit. You need God to speak. We as God's people need God to speak. And we are listening to every other voice in the world to tell us what only God can explain to us. And so as Daniel is looking for an interpretation of what's going on, God provides. Isn't that good news? Because I don't know about you, but there are lots of voices out there that are telling me what's real in the world. Please hear me today. God is real. Everything else will pass away. Right? It's all going away. Everything we put our hope in is going to go away. We're going to be left with Him. So let's listen to Him. When we need a word from the Lord, He provides. When we need His presence, He provides. We're His people. And Daniel wants to understand what he's seeing. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. That's awesome. Right? Daniel didn't go, hey, can somebody explain to me what I'm seeing? Gabriel, make him understand. He needs to understand this. You realize God has given us His Spirit to dwell in us. The same Spirit who raised Christ from the dead lives in us so that we would know Him. That's good news today. He has not left us guessing, and yet we live like we're just, I don't know what to do next. He has given us His Word and His Spirit. So He came near where I stood, and when He came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But He said to me, Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when He had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But He touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, where it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw, and this is very straightforward, right? As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, this is Darius, right? This is Cyrus. And so he goes on, that's very straightforward. You have the Media-Persian Empire. That's it. That's all you need to know. In fact, that's all he gives him. Right? He doesn't go on and say, hey, you need to know more about that. You need to know. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. They're going to be great. They're going to be strong. They're going to be mighty. You know that because you're experiencing that. You're going to experience that with Cyrus. He is experiencing that ram. He's experiencing that in his life right then. He thinks he's under great distress. Daniel has been taken into exile. Daniel is under great distress. His friends have been thrown into fiery furnaces, right? I mean, this is his life. And that's who he's dealing with at this point. He's dealing with people who would drink out of the holy things of God, right? He's dealing with those people. He's been thrown into a lion's den by these people. He realizes that they're strong and mighty. That's what he knows. And yet, here's what we have. You have all of this description of what Daniel sees, and here's what Gabriel tells him about this first beast, this ram, which Daniel describes in detail, which we could sit and we could spend hours trying to break apart every single detail. Here's what the angel says so that Daniel would understand. Remember, that's the angel's point. Hey, make him understand. Make him understand. Here's what he tells him. Did you catch it? Hey, that ram that you saw, that's the kings of Media and Persia. Moving on. It's literally what he does. So if we do more than that, we're trying to understand things that God may not want us to understand. Are you with me? Do you understand what I'm saying? If we dive into this and try to make up some things and speculate, we're going beyond what God wants us to know. God sent Gabriel, not like Joe angel, right? Like Gabriel angel, and said, make him understand. And Gabriel is like, those are the kings you're under right now. Moving on. And the goat is the king of Greece. This is to come. Okay? This is the king that's coming. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. We know him now, looking back, as Alexander the Great. Alexander was the most important king. He was the king of the Greeks. And in fact, he was the one who took that empire and just spread it. If you continue to look at what goes on in this vision, that's exactly what happens, right? He just spreads like wildfire. He took over the known world. In fact, Greek became the language that everybody spoke. Became the language of commerce, became the language that everybody spoke in the known world. And he spread like wildfire. He was young, and within like 10 years, he's dead. He's gone. He lived a wild lifestyle. And he went and he conquered all of the known world. And as this person, this Alexander the Great, the one that we know, this goat, as he's known here, it's the king of Greece. This great horn between his eyes rises up, and we're like, oh, okay, so we got the great horn on the goat who crushes the ram, so this must be the point, right? This must be the one that everybody's going to be paying attention to, because he's important. And we know, looking back, Alexander the Great, like there are books and books and books written on Alexander the Great, right? They made movies about Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great, we know how important Alexander the Great was. In fact, Alexander the Great was one of the ones that God used to even set up the world so that when Jesus came and the apostles went out to spread the world, there was a language that everybody spoke. And so the gospel could spread like wildfire. So Alexander the Great, that's the point, right? I mean, that's definitely the point. Well, then he goes, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. Okay, so we've just moved on. Are you with me? What we think is important, you could write this down, what we think is important is not important to God all the time. Just a little application for you. What we think is important and crucial, God sometimes sees as very small. We need to understand that. We look at the world, we look at world history, and we go, wow, Alexander the Great, man. He was the man. And God says he was a horn and got crushed, and his kingdom was broken up into 4 kingdoms. That's exactly what happened to Alexander's kingdom, 4 kingdoms. And one of those kingdoms becomes the focal point of the rest of the vision. Doesn't it? One of those horns, this little horn that pops up, becomes a focal point. One of those little horns, that little king that pokes up out of the forehead, right? Here's what we have. What's going to happen is he's going to be the focus of the rest of it. Why? Why not Alexander? Because Alexander served his purpose. He served his time. Hear me on this. As in chapter 7, we see in chapter 8 this great truth. Evil will have its day. Each king, each government, each worldly power will have its day, but in the end, God's going to have his day. Evil will have its day, but in the end, God's going to have his way. Are you with me? This is what we learn. And so Alexander the Great may look great in our eyes, but he's no king compared to the king. You have to come up with a different word than king if Jesus is king, right? You can't say Jesus is king, oh, and Alexander's a king too. They don't look anything alike. You just better come up with another word like punk or horn, maybe goat, because he doesn't look like a king compared to the King of Kings. And so here we have a picture of what we think is important. I mean, he's one of the top 5 all-time world leaders, right? I mean, like if you were to line up world leaders, Alexander would make the top 5 list. He's our all-star world leader. But the emphasis shifts quickly. And it shifts to someone you may have never heard of. And we can look back on history and we can see all of this and we can see this clearly. What this little horn, as we're going on, in the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face. He's one who lies. He's one who thinks very highly of himself. One who understands riddles shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and he shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. There's this little king. We know him now, and you may have never heard of him, as Antiochus Epiphanes. Ta-da! Your world just changed, right? We know him now as Antiochus Epiphanes. What did Antiochus Epiphanes do? Well, in the Syrian region, one of those 4 kingdoms, he persecuted the people of God. He defamed the glory of God. Let me just run down a list of a few things that he did. He ruled from 175 to 164 BC. The Jewish high priest in 175 was deposed by Antiochus Epiphanes. His last name, Epiphanes, means God, seer, right? He thought pretty highly of himself, right? I mean, he thought of himself as a god. In 171, Onias, who was the Jewish high priest, is murdered because of a bribe. The guy who murdered him is made high priest. 169 AE, let's just call him that for short. How about that? Exactly what instead of Antiochus Epiphanes. AE attacks Jerusalem. He butchers many of its inhabitants. He loots the temple. In 167, he orders all ceremonial observances to end. Sacrifices end. Did you hear that when we were reading through in chapter 8? For 2,300 evenings and mornings there would be no sacrifices. He took a pig. He built an altar to Zeus in the temple of the holy God. And he butchered a pig on an altar to Zeus in the temple of the holy God. Are you getting angry at this point? It's kind of like, it's like, where were the dirty dozen to take out Hitler at that moment? You know what I'm talking about? It's like, why didn't somebody take it? Well, there was a revolt. You can read about it in those parts of the Bible, those parts of like history that the Catholics keep in, right? You can read through the Maccabean revolt, and you can see what they did is they went against people and were able to, you can read more about this guy. In Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, you read about the abomination of desolation. I think this is a picture, at least, of what had happened in the past, and I believe there may be even a greater picture of it that's coming in the future, but I do believe that this is a picture of what was happening. 3 years to the day after the temple had been profaned, Judas Maccabeus led a successful revolt against AE, Antiochus Epiphanes, and restored and rededicated the temple, and a new altar of burnt offering was built. If you do the math, everything works out according to this vision. What was God saying? Why is this guy the important one? Why is this guy the one that God was focused on? I want you to hear me today on this, because this is very important. One, we already said this, if we're going to understand what God wants us to know, he's going to have to help us, right? He sends a messenger. He sends Gabriel to tell Daniel, the holy man, right? Surely Daniel will understand it. Every king on earth thought Daniel just knew everything, right? And God sends Gabriel so that Daniel will understand the vision. So we need God's help to understand. 2, what's important to us and what seems mighty to us is small to God. And 3, God cares far more about his people than he does about mighty kings. God cares about his people far more than he does about mighty kings. Why is Antiochus Epiphanes the one that he focuses on? Because his people are directly affected by Antiochus Epiphanes. His people are going to be under persecution. They're going to be killed. His name is going to be defamed. He cares more about his name and his people than he does about any king. He raises up kings, he puts down kings, but he loves his people. And that's good news for us today. I believe quite simply, if I were to tell you what we're supposed to get out of Daniel chapter 8, you need God's help to understand God. You can't understand him on your own. You can't understand his ways. You can't understand who he is. You can't understand how he's acting in the world today, how he's going to act in your life. You can't understand without his help. He has to reveal himself to you. He has to explain himself to you. He has given us his word and his spirit so that we will know him. But if he had not given us his word and his spirit, we wouldn't know him. There'd be no way. He has to help. Two, we see things as being really big and outside of the scope of what God can accomplish. And he's like, Alexander the Great is nothing. I'm king. I'm the Ancient of Days. And 3, he loves his people and his glory. And he cares more about his people and his glory than he does about mighty kings. That's good news for us today, because I believe what he wants out of us and what he wants this to produce in us is the same thing that it was meant to produce in Daniel. And Daniel, at the end of the chapter, says he was overcome and lay sick for some days. He was overcome with what he saw. The people of God, the place of God, God's glory, God's people are going to be defamed. But it's only for a time. Remember that. It's only for a time. He actually gives a specific amount of time. It's only for a time. But Daniel is brought down and sick. When you hear these stories of Christians being persecuted around the world, it just makes you sick to your stomach, right? When you hear about people being beheaded for the gospel, it makes you sick to your stomach. When you hear about people being thrown in prison for the gospel, it makes you sick to your stomach. And yet we are given the great hope in Revelation. As the martyrs are under the throne, they look up and they say, how much longer? He says, here's some white robes. Wait a little bit longer, because there are more people who have to die. The number isn't completed yet. There are more people who have to die for the gospel so that the gospel will spread, and the number isn't completed yet, but it's coming. And we say, how much longer? And he says, I have a day, I have a time, I have a number set, and it's coming. And we can trust him. And if that's true, what he wants from us is to persevere. Daniel knew 70 years. We're out of exile. But 70 years out of exile, we're going to go back and there's going to be this Antiochus Epiphanes guy. This guy, this little horn, is going to cause all this trouble. But it's only for a day. Evil will have its time. God will make it right. Persevere. Galatians 6:9. Let's not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. James 1:12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Hebrews 12:1-2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Persevere in speaking bold and loving truth. Daniel had this vision and went back to work. Look at verse 27. I lay sick for some days, then I arose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it until the handwriting on the wall, and he could see the signs. The day was coming, so he could speak bold truth to Belshazzar and to the people. He could speak bold truth to Darius. He could speak bold truth, persevere, because God's day is coming. God's day is coming. And that's good news for His people. Let's pray. Father, I pray that we would remember that even as we take the Lord's Supper today, we do this until Christ returns. This is a way of remembering that Jesus is coming back. So make us faithful to remember, and make us resolute so we'll stand perseverance and speak bold, loving truth. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.